Good evening, everyone, and an especially warm welcome to this wonderful and very large group of friends of the American Academy. This is a particularly gratifying and celebratory evening for us in honor of Karl von der Hagen and his wonderful memoir, which many of us have read already with enormous interest and pleasure, Surviving Berlin, and Norman Pearlstine. Karl and Norm are both former co-chairmen of the American Academy, and Norm is also a former president of the American Academy, so the homecoming has multiple dimensions. It's also a homecoming for our scholar participants, Kira Thurman, who was the Anna Maria Kellen Fellow here at the Academy last semester, and Stefan-Ludwig Hoffmann, who is a fellow all year at our friendly competitor, the Wissenschaftskolleg, just on the other end of the Grunewald. With their permission, I'm going to dispense with the usual American or German academic introductions. They've encouraged me to do so in the interest of a lively and improvised conversation. Our moderator will be Norman Pearlstine, and I expect, and I'm sure you all do as well, an extremely lively and somewhat informal conversation, after which we will have time for questions and answers. This microphone will be taken around to make sure that everybody can be heard, and then afterwards please join us next door for a reception. You will also note outside that there are copies of Karl's book for people to take home with you. We're going to impose, for those of you who know this reference, the United States immigration policy of one per family. So there are a fair number of books. These are also a gift of Karl von der Heyden. In more ways than one, he and Mary Ellen brought most of these with them in their luggage. So this is a substantial gift in both actual physical labor as well as spiritual generosity. So it's a great pleasure to pass the floor to Norm Pearlstine, and I think we'll go on from there. And welcome to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, it's a delight to be back at the American Academy, and particularly to be back to celebrate the publication of Karl's book. I first got to know Karl in 2006 when Richard Holbrooke convinced me to get involved with the American Academy. I had known Karl by reputation before that as a very successful business executive who had been the chief financial officer for 3 major consumer products companies, but also had been on the board of at least a dozen public companies. And so when I thought about the idea that Karl might actually want to write a book, I had all kinds of dreams that it would be about KKR or about Heinz or about some of the characters that you'd done business with over the years. But no, you had something much more important that you wanted to talk about, which is this book, Surviving Berlin. And I think maybe it would be good if you could just begin by telling us, why did you do this? What prompted the desire to write this book and to spend the amount of time that you did having to research your past and the past of your family as part of it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Norm, and thank you all for coming here. I'm flabbergasted that so many people came tonight, and it's so great to be back at the American Academy. And to answer your question, the American Academy had actually something to do with my writing this book, because some time ago, several years ago, the New York public television station, WNET, did a documentary on the American Academy in Berlin, which was financed by the Kellen Foundation, Kellen family. And in the process of making this documentary, I was interviewed by the executive producer, Mark Rosenwasser, and he afterwards came to me and said, you know, you really have an interesting story with combining your youth in Berlin and then coming to the American South. Have you written it down?" And I said, I wouldn't know how to do this. I'm not a writer. And he said, "Well, I would like to sort of interview you, and we'll do an oral history." And so we have to start with the concept that I never wrote this book. It's an oral history. We spent endless Sunday mornings in my apartment, and he would interview me. We would all record it, and he liked to have a glass of vodka even on a Sunday morning. So the discussion was very lively. He was non-linear. It went all over the place, and we went off subject many times. But the whole thing was then transcribed and eventually edited. I had a very good editor, and that's how this book came about. And so I have to say that I'm a little bit of a passive character in deciding how to write this book.
Well, you actually, I'm happy to say you thought you wanted to be a journalist, and since I didn't really want a lot of competition, I'm glad you decided to do something else. But in fact, before you got interested in business, you were one of the earliest publishers of, I guess, what would now be considered a blog or something like that.
Well, I think it was more than that. It was a very important newspaper in Berlin called Die Mücke. The mosquito. And I started writing my own newspaper starting at age 12, I guess, and did it for like 6 years. And I was my first money-making venture because I sent it to my relatives and parents and everybody, and they had to there was a certain price, but they usually added a little to it. So it was at that point I really was a journalist, but unfortunately I wasn't in your caliber, and so it didn't last.
No, on the contrary, I want to go back and research these, but one of the things that you do get into in the book, and it's something that I know Stefan has a particular curiosity about, is the generational differences with regard to the family, and particularly with your father, who really grew up in the period when Hitler was in ascendant, became a member of the party, and had a very different kind of attitude from that of your generation. And I wonder if you want to just talk a little bit about some of the questions that raised for you as you were reading the book.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed reading the book. I will just assume that most of you haven't read it, so I will ask questions that in some ways are answered in the book. What I really appreciated about the book was the honesty and the no-nonsense approach to this very difficult history that you took. And especially also how you talked about your parents. So maybe you can tell us a little more about your father and your mother and their experience of the early Third Reich. How did they embrace the first years of Nazism? Where were lines of conflict?
Yeah, in hindsight, I think the 20th century was really a terrible century. It was not a good century. My father fought in 2 world wars. He was a lieutenant in the Navy in the First War, and then he was in the Air Force in the Second War. And of course, Germany lost both wars. And after the First World War, as you all know, there was the Versailles Treaty, which was a direct predecessor almost to Hitler. And it was some people say the First War really never ended because many Germans felt that they really hadn't lost the war, and there were Jews and capitalists and other people who made that happen. And then you had the hyperinflation, and you had the Weimar Republic, which was struggling. And then finally you had the Depression, and the American loans were called. And that all indirectly led to Hitler's rise and eventually his election. And my father, having been, and my mother, through all these terrible times, most Germans felt that, okay, here's finally somebody who's going to get things straightened out in Germany. And so that's how Hitler got elected. And my father was an aircraft engineer for Junkerswerke, which later merged with Lufthansa. And he was actually chief engineer of Lufthansa. And that's why he wound up in the Air Force in the Second World War. And his career chances skyrocketed the minute Hitler came to power. And he joined the Nazi Party fairly early. I think it was before Hitler came to power. But his number was already like 869,000 or something, because they numbered them consecutively. And so I don't know. I think he believed in Hitler. It was also, I think, pretty much suggested to him that he should join the Nazi Party because he was in the aircraft industry. But I'm not saying that he was forced or persuaded to join the party. I think he joined it happily and voluntarily. And clearly didn't believe didn't choose to believe what was in Mein Kampf. You know, a lot of people thought Hitler was going to straighten out. And so he got, we had an actually good life during the Hitler years before the war. And it only turned into a tragedy later.
What I find remarkable about your father is at the end of the war, not unlike a number of German professionals, he was given an opportunity to work, in this case in Moscow, where his skills could be put to use, but he decided instead to go to a labor camp and spent 5 years away from family where you didn't know whether he was alive, where he was, and then he comes back. Do you have an understanding of what motivated him to make that kind of choice, and what did you find yourself dealing with his return?
Well, at the end of the war, he was in charge of Tempelhof Airport, and he actually turned it over to the Russians. And it was a very dignified ceremony, as I hear it. And they knew about him, and they said, we want you to work for him, because they needed German aircraft engineers. And the Americans had already grabbed most of them. Yeah. So, and my father refused. And why? And then he was sent to Buchenwald and became a regular prisoner of war, and eventually spent 5 years in Siberia. So he got the hot and the cold treatment. So why did he turn down the Moscow assignment? I think he was, in a way, a real patriot. And there was also a real hatred among the German population against the Russians at that time. So he was, in a way, a very principled guy. And he turned it down and paid the consequences.
Do you know what he did exactly during the war? You said he was in the
Air Force. He was immediately drafted. He was a captain and later a major in the Air Force, and he was in the Poland campaign in the whole Balkans all the way down to Crete. And then he was in Ukraine and Crimea. And his role was, he was at Air Force bases responsible for keeping the military planes in good operating condition.
Mm-hmm. Did his return, was that one of the things that motivated you to want to go to the U.S., some notion of needing to get away from family, or was it something else at work? that led to, I mean, there were not a whole lot of Germans hanging out at Duke University in the 50s, and so I'm just kind of curious what led to this.
No, he came back in 49. Late 49. I didn't get to the U.S. until 57. I was still in high school, in gymnasium, when he came back, and had no idea what I was going to do. And so that was not, I didn't decide, okay, he's back now, and it wasn't easy to integrate him back into the family, and I write about that. But it had nothing to do with my decision later on to go to America.
Kira?
Sure. Well, I'm thinking about the title of your book, and also about sort of your childhood, because part of what I found really fascinating is that your father, even though he's away at war, comes back sometimes to visit, and things like that. So I was wondering if you could share with the audience a little bit about what your childhood was like, enduring the war itself, how your family tried to protect you from it, but how you ended up experiencing it at various points anyway, I guess.
Well, my mother took over the family. I mean, there's no question about it, and she ran it brilliantly, and that continued even after my father came back. He could never find an entree again. But during the war, yeah, he would occasionally come back. He never talked about anything, just for brief periods. And so we experienced the air raids in Berlin and all of that. And then later in the war, we were moved the children were moved out of Berlin, but we were moved east, and then the Russians came, and we got to move west, and so there was a turmoil at that point, late in the war and right after the war, and that was fairly typical for most Germans.
Do you can you talk a bit about what you felt motivated the decision to go to Duke? At first, it was going to be just for a year. You didn't go with the idea that this was going to be a commitment that might change your life. You had a scholarship that you thought would give you enough money to do anything you wanted until you found out some of the differences between German and U.S. education and the cost of being a student at Duke. But can you talk a little bit about that and what you encountered and how it was different from what you anticipated growing up here?
Well, the biggest difference was that I came into a really peaceful country. Those of you who know Berlin, as most of you, know that the after-war years weren't exactly peaceful, with the airlift and the division of the city and blockade and everything else, 17th of June revolution. There was sort of a continuous state of threat and terror almost, particularly for the West Berlin population. And, we never knew whether the Russians would cash us in, the next day. And so coming to America as a student was during the Eisenhower administration. And I would now say that it was a golden era in America, a very peaceful country. I mean, there was the Korean War, but that had already been resolved when I came. And it was, to me, a real awakening, and to see everybody peacefully engaged, friendly, and supportive. It was a different world for me, and it immediately impressed me to the extent that I said, "Wow, this is really great." I love to be in America. I loved it right away.
You'd learned some English before you came, but it wasn't your first or second language.
No, I had been to a classical gymnasium with Latin and Greek, and then came English as a later language. So my English was pretty poor when I came to America, And one of the conditions was that in order to keep my scholarship, I had to maintain a B average, which wasn't easy. And I had to really study really hard, and I also had a lot of part-time jobs because I didn't have any money with me. I thought the $2,000 that I got as a scholarship, I didn't realize the tuition was $2,000. That was it, you know. I had no money for books, living expense, food, or anything. And they found that out the first day I showed up at Duke. I had $20 in my pocket. And so they had to get me part-time jobs right away. So it was really, really tough the first semester and even the first year. And that's why I decided I needed to stay on for another year.
You say that it was a very peaceful country and a peaceful environment, but there certainly were tensions that you observed. Among other things, the Duke of the 50s was a very segregated campus in a very segregated state. And that was, I think, something that you might not have initially fully appreciated, but became an important part of the book.
Yeah, that was really a shocker. I was really quite unprepared. I didn't know too much about the South, except Gone with the Wind, you know. That I knew. And that was about my knowledge of the American South. I had no idea that the campus, the university, was segregated at the time. And it's hard to imagine nowadays that, you know, Duke was segregated during my lifetime. And the whole South was segregated. I mean, it was essentially legalized segregation in the southern states, which the federal government didn't do anything about for quite a while. And so when I saw that, I mean, that was a shock. And of course, it reminded me right away of the Nazism, the racism under the Nazis. And so here was a little bit of an echo. Now, let's not compare what the Nazis did to the Jews with what the Americans did in the American South. Sure, there were lynchings, but there was no coordinated policy of mass extermination or anything like that. So it's not quite the same. But nevertheless, it was real, terrible segregation. And I think to me it had to do with the fact that after the Civil War, President Grant took it easy on the South. And they had won the war and they let it go. And Reconstruction started. And the old powers in the South, I don't know if you agree, took over again, and they basically blockaded equal rights for 80 years, right? I mean, in the South, and that happened all the way until the 60s. As a matter of fact, the worst problems with the integration didn't happen after I already arrived at Duke, the Selma marches and so on. So the worst was still ahead, but that's when it really started, the equal rights movement.
So, I mean, going back to a little bit about right before coming to Duke, I mean, then I am still really curious as to what you knew about the States, what you knew about American culture, what you knew about sort of African Americans. You have this example in your book, the story I thought was so fascinating about how at first Americans are coming to where your family is to sort of liberate. This is during the process of liberation in 1945, but then sort of stop and sort of backtrack, and so that the Soviets can take over. But that your sister does have an experience seeing an African American GI for the first time, you know, and sort of and then realizing that they weren't devils, I think is sort of the word that she uses for it. So I am sort of curious about perhaps before coming to Duke, what you might have known about the States, what you might have known about African Americans.
Unfortunately, very little.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, I was pretty ignorant, I have to tell you, and we didn't know much about my sister was interviewed as part of this book, and there's certain phrases, certain passages where she reports on what she saw during the war. And after the war, when the war ended, we were in a little town called Kalbe an der Milde, which is west of Berlin. And it was actually overrun by American troops one night. And the next day, my sister saw the first black soldier, who was very nice to her. And so she immediately gave up this concept of the devil, but that was sort of the image. And then the Americans pulled out, the British came over for a while, but then the British pulled out and the Russians took over. And that was, it was eventually turned out to be part of the Soviet zone, but we got invaded 3 times in this little town. And but my knowledge of African Americans, and not that anybody in the South called them African Americans at the time.
Right. Yeah. So what's that? I mean, in terms of part of your culture shock, right? I mean, that's what I find so fascinating is sort of arriving to Duke's campus. What are some examples, perhaps if you're willing to share, of realizing that there was this sort of racial barrier, if you will? I mean, of course, there's sort of segregation on campus, but I think there's more than that.
Yeah, well, the best example I can tell you is when I had a job at the Duke Hospital in the dietetics department, which was down in the cellar. And we had to take orders for special diets, and then they were put on hot trucks, and these hot trucks would be taken over to the wards. And I had to do that, take the orders, put the food in, take the trucks up. And during my break, I got to know an African-American guy who worked in the boiler room. We had a lot of African-American employees. For example, they had a maid that made the beds every day in our dormitory. And they were all black. And this guy and I got to know each other a little bit. First, we had a real language problem because he had a, pronounced African-American accent, and I had my own pronounced accent. But eventually we got to know each other quite well, and he told me that he had been in World War II in the Asian theater as a soldier. And then he told me that his son was a professional baseball player for the Cincinnati Reds. And I said stupidly, "Oh, did he go to Duke, And then I realized right away he couldn't have, So here was the son of a probably decorated American soldier in World War II who could not go to Duke. And here was I, this was 12 years after the war, a German who could go to Duke. If that doesn't bring home the point, very little will.
Yeah.
Stefan.
I want to backtrack a little bit, going back to Berlin. So while you were at Duke, there was simultaneously some kind of reckoning beginning with the Nazi past, right? That's one of the ironies, that you were in the Duke Library and you read, was it the Völkische Beobachter or some Nazi...
Völkische Beobachter.
Völkische Beobachter. So clearly you felt that you didn't have this kind of a conversation with your father after he returned from the war. So maybe you can describe to us, while you were still in Berlin, as a teenager, post-war Berlin, and then in 1950 when your father came, how was your own thinking about, the Third Reich evolving, and what were, signposts along the way? I know that Mary Ellen also played a role in this reckoning process. So maybe you can walk us through these moments a little bit.
Well, there are many people here, I think, maybe I've met some already who have had these experiences. We, of course, knew that we had lost the war, And the papers told stories about what had happened to the Jews in concentration camps. But in our daily life, that subject became very quickly taboo. My teachers at the Kant-Gymnasium in Spandau never talked about it, and several of them had been Nazi members and SS people even. And they were my teachers, so that continued on. And as we all found out later on, you know, the West German government of Adenauer, who was not a Nazi, but they employed many prominent Nazis, and there was really no appetite for prosecuting Nazis in post-World War Germany, or to talk about it. No one talked about it. And it was a time that I think it didn't, finally Germany came to grips with it, but I think it was much later in the 60s, after I had already left. But we didn't learn, there was no one was interested in talking about the war, and that applied to my father too when he came back. He didn't want to talk about it. And there was this difficult period in German history right after the war that lasted for probably another 15 years, when it was another very difficult period for Germany, because it was the failure to come to grips with the war guilt. And that's my personal opinion. And many of you may disagree, but Daniel Kehlmann, who is a well-known Austrian author, had a lecture in Frankfurt. In a lecture in Frankfurt, he talked about this period from a cultural perspective, and he said it was also a cultural wasteland in Germany. There was the Group 49. There was somebody like Ingeborg Bachmann, who was very assertive about what happened, and some other people in that group. Other than that, there was nothing but silence. So it was no surprise. It was a surprise to me when I found the complete edition of the Völkische Beobachter from 1932 to the end of the war at the Duke Library, and they were not microfilm; they were the full broadsheet. And I started saying, well, wait a minute here. So this was published during that time. What should my parents have known, you know? I mean, they all say we knew nothing, you know, Hitler did everything, we knew nothing. But the crimes were all there. I mean, they were explained and justified in some reason, but there was a lot known to the German population, in spite of the fact that they all voted for Hitler. And so to me, it was a huge eye-opener. And I said, well, people really can't change that quick. They can't be overnight go from total Nazi supporters to anti-Nazis. And it kind of turned me against Germany a little bit for a while there.
You know, the book has several different components to it. It's very much a story of growing up in Germany. It's very much a story about your years at Duke and what begins as a one-year gap year almost, where you thought you could just go to a lot of parties. You end up getting a Duke degree and then going on to get your MBA and so forth. The book is also a love story, very much involving you and Mary Ellen. And I think one of the things that's interesting in the book is not only with your sister and with your older brother, but with Mary Ellen, there are these italic passages in their voices that round out, if you will, some of your own observations. So, you know, Mary Ellen has an encounter with your father, which reveals a level of anti-Semitism that you might not have observed yourself. You have this year period where you think you'll spend the year in the States with Mary Ellen, and Mary Ellen goes to Germany thinking she'll spend the year with you there, and you end up communicating by letters. a whole lot different from internet dating today, I might suggest. But I was curious, especially given Mary Ellen's activities with the American Friends Service Committee, your involvement with it, and some of her dealings in East Berlin during this period when she's here, how much that might have informed your own thinking about Germany at that time, about the U.S. and so forth.
Well, Mary Ellen, of course, who's here tonight, thank you. She is a very important part. She should be sitting here because she's a very important part of this book, particularly the later stages. When she came to Berlin right after the wall went up in 1961, and she was going to work. She was working for the American Friends Service Committee on dealing with East Berliners, but all of a sudden, East Berlin was cut off. By the time she got over here, the wall had already been built, and so she engaged in she went over across Checkpoint Charlie probably twice a week at least for a whole year, and smuggled things and medicines and so on. It was very, very dangerous life, and she had her own experiences of which I didn't have because I was already gone. But it certainly. She also spent a lot of time with my family and my father and my brother, and they told her things that I didn't know and I hadn't known, and maybe they opened up more to her than they would have to me. And it was really my father's anti-Semitism, which he never talked about to me or to my sister or my brother. Even though we asked many times, he revealed it unwittingly, I might say, to Mary Ellen. So it shows a person who was formed in a different era, and all the experiences he had, he never got it right. That's really all I can say.
There is, not to interrupt, but there is one person I did want to ask you about in your family, in terms of perhaps getting it right, is Uncle Hugo in your story, where I think, and I wrote down the phrase at one point you said, you felt like he was the one person in your family among perhaps your parents and their siblings who had, I think, quote unquote, diagnosed and avoided the Nazi curse. So would you mind sort of perhaps talking a little bit about Uncle Hugo and how it was that you came to sort of see him in some ways as this role model, sort of standing up and sort of insisting, really getting into fights, it sounds like, with your father about the Third Reich, about Hitler, and really being adamant and insisting on the things that Hitler was doing anyway, it sounds like.
Yeah, he had been in World War I in the cavalry and had both of his legs shut off below the knee. So he was a veteran, a handicapped veteran, who became quite successful in the construction business in Berlin. And he and my father and my mother were good friends. And he was a real anti-Nazi from the very beginning. And he could get away with a lot of things that other people couldn't get away with because he was a veteran of World War I, and they took that into consideration to some extent. If he didn't hang the Nazi flag out on April 20th, it wasn't that big a deal. For everybody else, it was a big deal. And he got in. They warned him several times during the Nazi time about his views, but and he disagreed with my father and his friends about the Nazis, and they kept it civil though. It never really deteriorated into some animosity. And then when my father was in Siberia, he took on. My mother was running the show, and he took on a little bit of the father's role model, and I got to know him really well. He supported me in many ways. And he steered me into a business career away from journalism, by the way. And I'm very grateful to him. And he was like the father I never had. You know, he was a wonderful person.
Stefan?
There are some really vivid descriptions of Berlin in the book. One is when you were very young, when the family evacuated from the city, and you walked or went by car or bus or something through the city after bombing attacks. So that was one moment, and maybe you can talk about this a little. And the other moment that I found really interesting and striking was June 17th, 1953, when you were in the gymnasium and you were on a trip outside of the city, in the outskirts, and then you heard about the uprising, and you thought it might be a good idea to go there and to look around. So maybe you can talk about these two situations and how you experienced them.
Yeah, we lived in Spandau, but on the way to Gatow, in a little settlement called Weinmeisterhöhe. And it was elevated. Höhe means, you know, a hill. And so we were, during the war, we were able to, the planes would come from the west, they would overfly us and then drop their bombs. And we could stand at our front yard, or backyard, and basically saw the flames and the fires going up in various parts of Berlin. You know, I had a great, no, you couldn't see the houses, but you could see where the air raids took place. And but we were in a suburb, so however we got hit too because we had a flag station nearby, and they tried to wipe that out, and so our house got hit numerous times with incendiary bombs. They were able to put them out somehow, and but the real downtown Berlin, I didn't see until we left Berlin. We had our own air raid shelter. The city and the people in the city had to go to communal air raid shelters, and for the most part. And we drove. We had to drive in order to go to the town east of the Oder River, where we were going to go. We had to go through Berlin, and it was one evening after air raids, or one night in a car. And I saw whole blocks in flames. You know, this was unbelievable because, first of all, there were no firefighters anywhere to be seen. There was no. It was quiet. There were people rummaging around, but it was a ghostly scene and also a ghastly scene, and. That really shook me up because that was really, I was only 7 or so at the time, or 8. And you know, I'd never seen anything like that, and that was the real, until then I didn't realize why my parents wanted us out of Berlin, and then I realized this was really a dangerous situation.
I'd like to open this up for questions in a second, but let me just first note that toward the end of the book, you do talk a little bit about lessons learned and your feelings about some of the more important issues of the day now, and particularly developed a well-honed aversion to extremism that I've seen in the way you address problems and issues, with kind of willingness to hear both sides of a story before making up your mind. But as you look back on the book itself and that formative period of your life, and now think about Germany today, the U.S. today, are the issues that you see now sort of a linear extension of what you grew up with, or is there something new and different going on that really needs a set of different responses?
Well, the situation today is very concerning, both I think in the US and to some extent in Europe. There is, next to the book where my books are available to be picked up, there is an op-ed piece I wrote for Time magazine a while ago, which talks about this, and you may want to pick up a copy of that if you're interested. There are parallels, and it seems to me that these lessons that everybody learned in World War II are now, 2 generations later, tend to be a little bit forgotten. And some of the same feelings and beliefs come out again, particularly nationalism. I mean, we have America first, which is a really stupid concept. And you know, this is it's been an international word for many years now. It's the best thing that has happened to the world is the globalism that we have, and has basically produced peace for Europe for many, many years. And to now come in with these outdated nationalist concepts is can only be explained because the memory is lost of what really happened during those years. And you know, we had the Marshall Plan. America saved Europe from communism. And the airlift saved Berlin. All of these were American initiatives. And I've been proud to be part of America as a country that takes its leadership role in the world seriously. And now we are abandoning it. We want to win, you know, we want to win in a trade negotiation. What does that mean? There are no winners, you know, I mean, or everybody's a winner. And so we have a very, that kind of nationalist attitude then awakens other underlying concepts like anti-Semitism, Nazism, even in the States, and all kinds of base feelings that had been missing. Meanwhile, in Europe, you have the radical right, you know, coming up with similar concepts. So it seems to me that there's a cycle in history that every 80 years or so, people have forgotten what history teaches you. And maybe we're not teaching it properly to our children. I don't know the answer.
Well, as a historian, I might object to that a little bit. We're trying.
Yeah.
I feel like we're trying really hard. You know? If I may, I mean, the thing that I really appreciated about your book was the emotional honesty in it, as I think Stefan has already alluded to. And so maybe also, if you don't mind reflecting before we turn it over to everybody, you know, sort of, at least for me, and it also reminded me of, I guess I'll sort of throw out one sort of book recommendation or name for other people, which is Nahama Tek, who's a sociologist, who's written a lot about looking at sort of World War II and the Holocaust and what it took to resist, what it took. She wrote Defiance, which was then turned into the movie, right, and things like that. So, I mean, you've lived in some ways this exceptional life, and I'm curious, and I have Nahama Tek in the back of my mind here a little bit about, you know, what did it take for you, or what perhaps helped you to sort of start thinking differently about what you were seeing in the world, even at times when maybe other people weren't seeing it your way.
Well, I would say that at Duke, I certainly saw the evils of segregationism. And there were some student demonstrations already going on against the fact that the blacks had to sit upstairs in the movie theaters, you know, those kinds of protests. And I write in the book that I declined to participate in those processes, in those protests, because I felt I was a foreign student and this was not my business, which was total nonsense and cowardly. And I should have participated in these demonstrations because I knew better at the time. So it wasn't until much later when I became a trustee of Duke University. And I said, we have a real responsibility here. We're a Southern university with a pretty bad history. and we need to make up for it. And now I think Duke, of all the elite universities in the United States, has the highest percentage of African Americans on campus. And it has become a truly diverse institution that everybody can be proud of. But I was very active at that point in pushing for it. And I said, you know, we got to do whatever it takes, even if it means some academic concessions. We got to get that percentage up. And we did. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, partially about just, you know, I mean, at least in your own life, it seems like there have been various moments. I mean, perhaps it was just simply discovering the Völkische Beobachter and things like that. But, you know, where you sort of came to conclusions yourself on your own, it sounds like. And that might have been different from your family, that might have been different from the people around.
And I'll ask you to make this a short answer.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to let you ask any more questions because we have people here who would like to participate.
Right.
No, all I can say is on the Duke campus, I became pretty much a pacifist. And, you know, it changed my whole way of thinking. And you know, I'm not a total ideologue about it, but it was my education that eventually turned me around.
Questions, please. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little about, just at the end of the war, I was very moved by your description of the bombing, and so I'm quite interested to know what an average day was like in 45, 46, how you got through it, really, because we see those terrible films of Berlin totally wrecked, and people collecting bricks and trying to tidy up the city.
Yeah, we, you know, there was a lot of starvation and hunger. Hunger was totally permanent with all of us for a long time. And we didn't collect bricks, but we returned to Berlin in October of 45. Our house was still intact, but it was occupied, full, of course. And my father had been a Nazi, so there was really no chance. And finally, through the intervention of this Uncle Hugo, we were able to get a couple of rooms in the house. And then we basically did what every Berliner did. We scrambled for food. My brother, who was 7 years older, he took the train out into the country, and we gave away whatever Oriental works we had left. And we got food, and we converted our backyard into potato fields and everything that was edible. And we made it through the winter, you know, by hook or by crook. But it was the toughest time. I mean, quite frankly, if you want to know, for me as a child, the war wasn't so bad. We had enough to eat. Yeah. It was after the war that the real problem occurred. Those were very difficult years, 46, 47, and then we just got out of the woods, and then the airlift came. So, you know, here went the fresh food again, and no milk, and so on. So it was a difficult time all the way through, I would say, the end of 49.
One question back here, and then Michael, I'll
yeah, thank you very much. We know what it takes. You have to go back. It hurts. So, my question: did you know from your father anything about Yukos, Hugo Yukos? Because the Nazis bought him out. He wanted he was a genius, constructing the first aluminium plane. He was metering the gas. However, he died in despair. He got some millions and died near Munich, quite alone. Did your father talk about anything like that, about his work? And the second, we have this period of after the victory. Over the victim of Germany, the Allies, they made this Vier-Mächte-Abkommen, which is still serves as the basis of the of the situation here in Berlin. So did you know anything about that, about at that time, that it was a big thing that the world would unite at least over after the...
Well, the first question, yeah, Yukos was a genius. My father was very proud working for him in Dessau first, and then in Berlin. And he was actually, you may have heard about the Yukos 52, yeah, which is was sort of a iconic plane, 3 engines.
Very reliable.
Yeah, and my father was he was a safety nut. He insisted on the 3rd engine. And they used it during the Crimean War to drop all the parachutists, and he was involved in that. But you know, Junkers merged with Aeroloid, which became Lufthansa, and so he transitioned into that. So as to the other part of the question, Vier-Mächte-Abkommen, yes, I know all about it. That was very important in Berlin because we were supposed to be governed by it. And so vestiges of it remained throughout the Cold War. I bicycled every day to school past the Spandau prison, where they changed the guards every month. You know, they rotated the British, American, and French. There were more troops there than there were prisoners. And so that was very important, although it was obviously not complied with. You know, it was only a facade at the end. Didn't mean anything.
Michael.
Carl, when we met about 20 years ago or so and started getting close, I really saw you as an American. You were an exceptionally successful American businessman. I never really saw you as a German, notwithstanding that funny name and that little trace of a funny dialect that you speak. You would never speak in German with us. And I have the impression that this has changed. We sometimes speak German today, and you talk about your German heritage. Has, writing the book kind of reconciled you with your German background?
No, I think what reconnected me with Germany was actually Dick Holbrooke and the founding of the American Academy in Berlin. I had spent 30 years basically never talking German. And as you say, I had immersed myself in America, thought this Germany thing is a thing of the past. And then he got me involved with the American Academy. We talked about it and what the mission would be, and that is to bring America's best intellectuals, scholars to Berlin so that they could interact with their peers in Germany. And that was an American initiative, which I supported because on my rare visits back to Germany during these 30 years, I found a lot of prejudice against America, which got me really mad. And especially about American superficiality and the fact that there was very little intellectual life in America, no serious thinkers. Meanwhile, Americans won all the Nobel Prizes. And I couldn't figure it out. My parents were violently opposed to me attending an American university. They said, that's nothing, that's like high school here. And so there was this prejudice. And I think the American Academy has done a lot over the years to have everybody a better understanding of American and Germans, because they're not that different, and so that's how I started reconnecting with Germany, through this institution, actually.
Yes, please.
You've already spoken quite a bit about your time at Duke, and I have two questions with regard to that. The first, you spoke very eloquently about your first encounter with segregation at Duke and how shocking this was for you and maybe even disillusioning. But I'm wondering if you had the same reaction to the quotas imposed upon Jews, for example, at various universities and perhaps at Duke at the time. That's one question. The second question is about how your fellow students at Duke received you, and did they ask a lot of questions about your German past and your childhood?
I initially had no idea that there were Jewish quotas at American universities. Now, I might add that not too many Jews in 1957 wanted to study in the South. So we had Jewish students, we had a Jewish fraternity, and we had a very good Jewish basketball player. But the problem with the Jewish quotas was, I think, at the Ivy League up north, and that didn't dawn on me until later. It's clearly not a good thing, and now there's a lot of talk about the Asians, too many Asians. So they're trying to keep a balance between various demographic groups, and in principle that's to be commended, but you cannot openly discriminate against anybody. So I hope that answered that question. And the other one as to how my students, or my fellow students, we see there wasn't a lot of curiosity. I mean, you wouldn't believe how provincial the South was in those days. and Duke was still not a national international university, it was a very prominent Southern university. And some student asked me, "Oh, where are you from, Berlin? Is that in Germany?" "Yeah." "Can you drive there?" he asked. There was a certain amount of not just naivete, stupidity among the student body. And but I had a roommate who was from Maxton, North Carolina, and he was very interested. He wanted to learn German. He later became a very distinguished. He joined the State Department, had a very distinguished career in the State Department. So there were the germs of a great university already there, but no, there wasn't a lot of curiosity. There wasn't also a lot of animosity, I thought maybe as a German they would kind of look down. And, I was the only German student in a population of 7,000 students. So it was kind of a unique situation. Nobody paid any attention to it. And they made no concessions to me. As they now do for foreign students, by the way. Everybody goes overboard, to accommodate the foreign students.
Yes, please.
Mr. von der Heiden, I'm very much interested in what you said, because it's my own experience is practically the opposite. I am 10 years older, and the way I experienced the Nazi time and my family, I can't contradict you because it's your life. But I also came to the States, and so it's not a question I have, just a statement.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. We have time for a couple more, so go ahead, please.
There's one in the very back as well who's been raising their hand for a while.
As a former student to Chicago University, I want to congratulate you for your experience with Duke University. Even at Chicago, I couldn't get away from Duke. Because when I, in '54, went to the administration, the university administration there, in order to ask, or to say that here I am and do you want to still receive me, they sent me to a dormitory, to a specific room. And when I entered the room, there were two roommates, and they were very nice, and they showed me my bed. And to my amazement, over the bed, against the wall, was fixed a huge flag, the Confederate flag. And I was very funny already at that time. And therefore I said, but I came to this great country in order to sleep under the stars and stripes. And you know what the answer of my two roommates from Duke University, as I found out was, if that is so, you better find yourself another room. And so for a whole year, I slept under the Confederate flag. And I have never forgotten, and I even mentioned it to my then boss, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, at the time of German unification, and explained to him that German unification would still take at least a generation, if not more. And I am today convinced that I was overly optimistic when I said thank you.
Kira has pointed out there was a question in the back. If someone wants to.
How are we doing time-wise?
Wrap up.
Where and how did you learn from about the fall of the wall in Berlin? How did it affect you? And did it affect you more as a then American city or as a former German citizen?
Well, I've always been a Berliner, okay, in a way. Berliners cannot change their stripes, like New Yorkers. So I've always been fond of the city, not so fond of Germany in general. And the fall of the wall I experienced on an ocean liner, traveling from Europe to New York. And that's described in the book in a little bit more detail. But I knew it would happen because the refugee exodus just before the war went up rapidly, and people were talking about they're going to do something. And so I was not surprised about it. But I came to America then, back to America, and 4 days later, my now wife sailed for Berlin, and she can tell you the rest of the story.
With that, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight and for being such a great audience with such great questions. Michael, thank you so much for hosting the event. And Kira and Stefan, thank you for not only participating, but doing remarkably careful reads of the book. The questions I didn't get to that both of you posed, I think we're going to have to assign to Carl as homework and see what he answers if given time to do so. But thank you very much for this, and I think we have time for some conversation outside as well.